Ladies and gentlemen, the next session, 2020 Census, is sponsored by Comcast Business. Please welcome the Mayor of the City of Detroit, Mike Duggan, Chairman of the Board for Latin Americans for Social and Economic Development, Jane Garcia, Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of Access, Hassan Jaber, Executive Director for the Detroit 2020 Census Campaign, Victoria Kovari. And to moderate the conversation, please welcome President and Chief Executive Officer of the Detroit Regional Chamber and former Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Commerce for the 2010 U.S. Census, Sandy Baruah.
All right.
This one?
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Mayor, thank you in particular. I know how busy you are. You had a pretty big day yesterday.
Yeah, things are, got a little bit of property to buy, but we're going to see if we can't get that plant built over on the east side.
Well, when Automotive News called me about it, I said, well, when Mayor Duggan stands in front of an audience and says something is going to get done, it's going to get done. Hope is not a strategy for you.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting tonight with the neighbors who live immediately next door, and we're going to need buy-in from the surrounding community, but we're sitting in their neighborhoods having these conversations, and so far the response has been very positive.
Well, congratulations. This is an amazing piece of news. Sir, congratulations on that big piece. So here we are at a conference talking about Detroit 2030, but we're at a panel talking about the 2020 census. And there may be a handful of you in the audience who might be scratching your head saying, okay, why are we talking about this? So Mr. Mayor, why are we talking about the 2020 census?
Well, I think most people know the census determines how much representation we have in Lansing and in Washington. It determines how much federal money there is from everything from health care to housing to roads, and people need to be counted. And Detroit got hit pretty hard in 2010. We had just gone through the transition from Kwame Kilpatrick to a new mayor. I think it came up kind of quickly, and in 2010, Detroit had the worst response rate in America at 64% of our residents voluntarily turning in their forms before you go out and knock on the doors. Now, I know a little bit about this because in 1980, when I was an undergrad at the University of Michigan, my summer job was a census taker. And I was in Ann Arbor.
So you've been going door to door for a long time.
I have. And in 1980, I was knocking on doors in Ann Arbor. And the discussion about the minority undercount, I can tell you from firsthand experience, it is real. When I knocked on the door of a Caucasian versus an Hispanic versus an African American in racially mixed neighborhoods in Ann Arbor, there is a level of distrust. And when you go to the home of somebody of color and ask how many bathrooms they have, they want to know why the government wants to know. And so every major city in the country has a challenge. But in this case, we took one of our absolute stars, Vicki Kovari, and asked her to take a leave from her job as Deputy Director of the Department of Neighborhoods for 2 years to run this program. We're going to go do everything we can to get people counted.
Great. So Vicki, let's turn to you. So the mayor's kind of outlined broadly why the census is important, you know, representation, but let's bring it down to kind of that next level. What does it mean for the citizen of Detroit in terms of how well the census turns out for us in 2020?
Well, the mayor alluded to the funding. So when you fill out the census, you're part of our population count. Population counts determine how much money is distributed from the feds back to the state and the city. Those programs then directly flow back to the resident in the form of food stamps, Medicaid, school lunch programs, highway construction. So these are things that impact everyday Detroiters' lives. So filling out the census is just not like an obligation or sometimes a nuisance, but it does directly impact people in their everyday life through these programs. So we have some real challenges in this census that we're going to have to overcome, and we're prepared to create a really robust campaign over the next 18 months to be able to do that.
So here's a stat for the audience, and I love this one, the power of it. So we're a nation of roughly 330 million people, give or take. There's 132 federal programs that distribute $675 billion based on population. So when you think about, different types of population, so if the population count isn't right in terms of where they are in zip code, that's $675 billion through the 132 programs doesn't get distributed in a proper way, so the impact of that.
And you don't get the next numbers for 10 years.
Right.
So you're dealing with them for 10 years. So that's a real impact in a city like Detroit.
No, Jane, that's a really good point. So Jane, you were around when the census was done here in...
I've been around for the 1980, 90, 2000, and 2010.
I wasn't going to date you quite back that far. But so clearly in 2010 in Detroit, it was a different time. Different leadership, different time, different financial situation. Talk a little bit, and you've mentioned this to me a few times, how did the non-governmental actors help with the census in 2010?
Well, we were, as you well know, 2007 and 2008, we were really coming out of a very bad situation. And the situation is that we went before. As community agencies, we're very supportive, but so were the businesses. Had it not been for the businesses to get the notices out, to try to cut some of the fear. There's fear no matter what, and when you were dealing with immigrants, you're dealing the fear that somebody could knock on their door afterwards. The word was to try to convince them that no matter what, we had a history, that nothing had ever been given to the federal government. But it's very hard to convince people of that. So the churches were real important, but specifically the businesses, DTE, Comerica, Ford, General Motors, they all stepped up to the plate and definitely had contests and, they did a lot of things to educate the community. And we thought that it wasn't the greatest census, obviously, but it could have been a lot worse had we not had that assistance.
Hassan, what was your experience working with the Census 2020 in in the communities that you represent and assist?
So I think that we have a very serious concern about the 2020 census. We have these old challenges, which is that there are these hard-to-count communities that the census did not do a good job capturing the numbers. And by the way, City of Detroit has a very high per capita, hard-to-count communities, including African Americans, including immigrant groups, including renters, including children under 5. There are more than 5% miscount of children in the city and outside the city. So that's a big old problem that we haven't been resolving, and we should, because the stake is too high. 40% of the state budget comes from federal money that will be impacted by census figures. The other new challenges for us are that one is that we kind of politicized the census this year by adding this citizenship question. By census own account, sending a report to the president saying that if the citizenship questions continues to be included, then we lose 20% of the count. That's a huge number of people. So that's something we have to talk about, and we have to find a way to resolve. Second is the census is going digital, it's going online. And there are these issues of privacy, confidentiality that is, the mayor mentioned, that is going to be way up front. And we're going to have to come together as a community talking about how do we communicate in a way that we address concerns, but also make sure that everyone is being included and counted.
So Jane, this might be a basic question, but I think it's important for people to understand. Why are some of our populations more difficult to count? Why is it more challenging, as the mayor said when he was knocking on doors? Yeah, but explain, why do people hesitate? Certain populations hesitate to, I don't know if I want to fill out a government form. Can you explain that a little bit more so people
one of them
understand
is obviously, as you fill out the government form, first of all, it's a government form, and that's scary. And then second of all, and worse than I've ever seen in this environment, people are very afraid. We're hoping the churches jump in, because we helped a lot of the churches that were able to assist in the last 4 censuses. And I think that we're going to have to wrap up the community. Corporations are going to help. But the churches are very important because the communities, and it wasn't just the immigrants, it was everybody that, wait, they're going to tax me more. We're talking about there was a whole lot of different reasons, or I'm not living here and I don't want to fill out the form here. So there was a lot of other reasons what was going on, but I think that what made the difference, and we've come together, and I think Detroit is one of the greatest places. We weren't the greatest count, but there was a lot of people assisting and educating them the importance of the census, because if we lose population, we lose it for 10 years. So there have been lawsuits in the past, so, because they asked for a recount, but there's been a significant undercount among minority communities, period.
Hassan brought up the 2020 census, so let's go there, Mr. Mayor. He brought up the issue of the citizenship question, but there are other challenges that the 2020 census presents us that are even more pronounced than previous censuses. You want to talk about some of the challenges we have to overcome?
There can be any number of things, and of course, you have the citizenship question. The Constitution of the United States has never, from its inception, counted citizens. It's inhabitants of an area, because of course, when the U.S. was first formed, there were no American citizens. And so the idea of sticking a citizenship question after 220 or 30 years
untested, by the way, Mayor.
Right. It's never been an issue. There's only one reason to do it. And then if you look at some of the social media scams that are done, the federal law is clear. The Census Bureau cannot share your data with any other federal agency. But we're already seeing early signs of scare tactics. Don't fill this out. They'll use it in this way. It'll go to Customs and Immigration. It'll go to the IRS. It'll go here. And so we're going to have to deliver messages. And of course, it appears that these things may be funded in the same kind of strategies that we saw from the Russians to try to deal with response in a particular area. That's the downside. There's an upside, and the reason why I'm not so terribly negative is, while we haven't worked out all the details, it looks like for the first time, we'll be able to send troops on the ground in addition to the census takers, and you'll be able to fill out your census form on an iPad or a tablet as we go to the door. Now, when I was a census taker, and even the last cycle, you had to put it in a piece of paper, mail it in. And so while we have a downside in this technology could potentially disrupt us message-wise, there's an upside that our field crews could sign people up more quickly using this technology. And that's why we're getting started a year ahead of time, is to make it work to our advantage.
So just a quick story. 10 years ago, when I was working on the census, we were originally going to market, if you will, with not tablets, but electronic devices. And, well, they ended up not working. So we decided not to do that. Jane, go ahead.
No, I think one of the things
technology's changed a lot.
They
in the
did,
last
you
10
know
years.
that.
Yeah.
One of the things that one of the challenges for us is that in 2010 we had 12 regions. We no longer have 12 regions, and we don't have a region in Michigan. So I think that's one of the challenges, because you went from, with their wise decision, they went from 12 regions to 6 regions. And not always did the states meet their count. But I think that those are the things that if we can inform people that to fill out the form when it gets to your house, and you won't have an enumerator come and ask you questions. That is the greatest thing you can really get out there, whether it's commercials or the businesses or the churches. But fill out the form when they come. Fill it out, mail it in. They only follow through if you don't answer the census.
So I'm sorry. So I want to get Victoria in.
So I think one of the ways in which we're looking at trying to handle that is by setting up questionnaire assistance centers in at least 150 places all over the city, where we can have folks actually help people log on, help them troubleshoot if they have problems. We're talking about recreation centers, libraries, social service centers where there's a lot of foot traffic, Head Start sites, so the population of children under 5 are going to go directly at that. We're also going to have census captains for every single census tract, people who know the territory, who know at a block club meeting they can go there with a tablet, a laptop, and get people to sign up right there, in addition to the canvassing that we're going to do. So we're going to have sign-up events at different locations. So we're planning a whole robust outreach effort to get, and we've looked at every single tract in the city. We know which ones are low responding. We know which ones have responded at 70 or above. And so we're going to target our intervention in that way, whether it's trying to persuade people to respond more or making sure that those that have responded continue to do so and maybe do better at it.
So, Victoria, now Jane mentioned, the reduction in the number of regions that the Census Bureau is going to deploy this year. What you didn't say is that the number of census workers is being reduced dramatically from previous censuses. We're going to have fewer, I would say, what the mayor did in 1980, knocking on doors with the theory that the ability to fill it out electronically will reduce the need for people on the ground. We'll see how that works. So you're in the best position to kind of give us the broad strategy that you and the mayor have developed to address this problem. We know why it's important. We know that there's challenges, right? So what is the city's broad strategy to go into the 2020 census and get a good count?
So we had our first Detroit Complete Count Committee at the end of January, and we had 25 people in 40 below weather.
It was 7 degrees, by the way, that day.
Right. It was really, everybody else was closed. We were open, and we had 25 people show up.
Yeah.
So there was a tremendous amount of energy. We've got a really great committee on communications, looking at our communications plan, both traditional media and online. We have an outreach meeting, actually, after this meeting, where we have representatives from all these different constituency groups that are hard to count. We have a schools outreach program where we're going to have lessons in the schools in winter of 2020. We're going to do sign-ups at parent-teacher conferences. We're going to have Census Sundays in churches during the core response period between mid-March and mid-July. We're going to do a really robust field operation in conjunction and coordination with the Census Bureau's field people. In this first phase, we're going to have a really robust messaging campaign. So we're developing some key messages. We're taking it on the road. So we're going to be making presentations before block clubs. We're going to be making presentations at a lot of different community groups to talk about why it's important. So this period now, the next 7-8 months, we're really going to be pounding the pavement to talk to people about what's at stake, so that by the time the census goes live in mid-March, we've got people really geeked and ready to go. So that's, we're raising money right now for a big chunk will go to a media campaign, but also to hire canvassers next year. So this whole thing is going to be driven by data and technology. All the targeting, our Detroit Innovation Technology Department has been able to load all of the census data. We have maps showing us where we have block clubs and other agencies that we can use in this. So our whole field operation is going to be driven by our data collection and analysis.
And so you think about the magnitude. Of course, we have, I think, the finest IT director in America, Beth Niblock, who is creating what is essentially a duplicate census strategy for Vicki to use out of the city of Detroit. But think about the magnitude of our situation. In this city today, I will bet you we have upwards of 20,000 residents who are claiming to live at a relative suburban address because of car insurance. I'm sure there's people in this room.
You think there's only 20,000?
I think there's easily 20,000 who say I live with my mom and dad in Sterling Heights, or right. I used to ask for a show of hands. People don't do that anymore. But think about this: the census itself isn't connected to car insurance. For the census, you need to fill out where you normally reside, and one of our key messages is going to be: if you want the city of Detroit to have representation, if you want us to have the resources to deliver service, we need you to honestly fill out the form where you reside without fear that somebody's sending it to AAA. These are the levels of complexity.
And it's not connected to the voting rolls either.
It is not. But you look at the high-rise apartments throughout downtown and Midtown, 2/3 of the people in those high-rise apartments today claim they don't live in the city. If we don't get those folks to fill out their census where they really reside, we are behind the 8 ball for the next 10 years. And so you can see why we're starting early. These are going to be really important messages, but there is a group of people who can educate their fellow tenants in these buildings to say, hey, we need to make sure we fill this out where we really live. It won't hurt us anyplace else. Those are the kinds of things we got to talk about.
So, Mr. Mayor, Victoria kind of outlined the broad strategy that the two of you have developed. It's going to take resources. 10 years ago, the city of Detroit spent 0 on a census effort. How are you doing it for this upcoming census?
What's our budget now?
Well, I think we're up to $1.7 million. So the city's putting in about $500,000. We're going to be going to philanthropy, our corporate supporters to try to raise the rest. So
We've had lots of help. You know, Bloomberg Associates, New York City is extremely sophisticated at this. They put huge resources in. Their head of census has come in here, done training for our folks. And so we're going to be appropriately resourced. And $1.7 million is a good start, but between the media messaging and the troops on the ground, we're going to have to get it up significantly by the time next spring rolls around. And given the support we've seen so far, I'm confident we will.
So in the communities that you serve, access, you know, what kinds of activities do you anticipate taking on to drive this count to a good number?
So let me mention that the immigrant community in the Detroit region is a growing community, by the way. So language support is critical. The issue of privacy that the mayor spoke about and confidentiality. Who's carrying the message should be a trusted carrier. These are media, the ethnic media will play a big role in this conversation. But listen, all of this, there is a statewide effort now being formed by MNA, Michigan Nonprofit Association, to make sure that we have not only a city strategy, but we also have a state strategy and connect these.
And they were actually supposed to join us on the panel. There was a death in the family, so.
So it's really gonna take a collective effort. This is a problem that doesn't impact one community and leave others. It's a problem that will impact all of us. Rich, poor, business, community centers. The business community rely on census in making business decisions. So it's really an issue that for all of us to come together, and especially hard to serve, and immigrant communities are hard to serve. Not only the barriers of information, the barriers of language, the barriers of culture, but there are also these very intense fear environment that these communities are going through. And we're gonna have to engage in a very honest, transparent conversation about why we need to do this collectively.
And
So
Jane,
the message, I guess the message is also that we need to have bilingual people in all the communities, because I think that's going to be real important. And I'm not sure, and ahead of time, each city should ask the Census Bureau to make sure that they have the bilingual material that they'll need so they don't have to produce it. They make it in Washington, so you need to make sure that we have it, so that's a cost that we could save. And I think that needs to be asked ahead of time so we will be equipped with the right resources that we need.
So Jane, what's the schedule for the census? When does it start? When does the campaign start that you're leading? When does the actual census count begin?
Census Day is April 1st.
yeah, so on April 1st of 2019, in a little more than a month, we're going to be having a year-out event. So we're going to be bringing block clubs and nonprofits and churches all together to really coalesce and rally around the census. And that'll kick off our messaging campaign. In March of 2020, March 12th actually, the census is supposed to go live, and they'll send out the first of a series of mailings to people. It won't, though, be until the 4th or 5th mailing will they actually send you a form, a paper form in the mail. You can request a form, you can call to fill out the census, and they'll have a dozen different languages. But it'll go from mid-March until mid-July, about July 20th, 24th. So we'll have that period of time. Right now, our concentration is on messaging and really educating people about the importance of the census. The core response period is actually from mid-March until the May 1st, If you haven't responded by May 1st, that's when the census workers go out on the street and start knocking on your door. And they'll do that until about the second or third week of July.
And
then
will
that's
you
it.
get that data? Obviously, the Census Bureau will have the data of who hasn't completed their census form. Will you and the city get that data so?
We will get daily updates of response rates. In tracks. Right now, we're pushing the national and regional folks to provide that data on a block level. And there is a possibility that we'll get it on a block level, but we know that they'll do daily updates of response rates. They won't give us address information because that'll be in violation of Title 13, but they will give us at least census tract, if not block level data, and then we'll be sending out rapid response teams and be deploying people to those areas where the response rates are fallen below our targets.
So if you think about the logistics of this, and this is, you can tell by listening to Vicki how good she is and why she's in charge of this. This is almost mind-numbing when you think about it. So they send out these forms in March. You have a lot of employees for the U.S. Census Bureau that are hired for a year. They can actually see the returns. We're going to have troops who are going to go out and hit doors. Our troops, at least we haven't solved it yet, are not employees of the Census Bureau, which means that if a particular census tract has a 50% response rate on May 1st, and we want to send our troops out, we don't know which 50% we're hitting, which means we send our troops to the neighborhoods that have got 30 and 40% response rates, figuring our chances are better of finding a new one than 80%. Now, as I say that, the flip side is we think we're going to be able to get responses off a tablet. So it cuts both ways, but if you could imagine the logistics of what's going to be a duplicate door-knocking campaign out of Vicki and the nonprofits team, and it still remains to be seen how cooperative the federal government is. And as Vicki says, if they'll narrow it down to the block, now we can target blocks where we've only got 20% response. If it's a census tract, it's a far less efficient operation. And you would think after all these years of counting people, we wouldn't be having this debate a year out, but we are.
So, with so many fewer census workers going to be on the ground for 2020 than in previous censuses, how is that going to work, Victoria? I mean, how is that going to work with, getting, when you have a low census return area, are they going to have the human resources to be able to collect, or is that going to be left to local communities?
Well, we're not taking any chances, right? I think our nonprofit community is going to really be instructive about helping us staff those questionnaire assistance centers, but the Census Bureau right now is way behind in their own hiring targets. So the shutdown had some impact, but they need to recruit 20 or 30 people for every person they hire, and they are nowhere near that right now. These are jobs, they're going to send the first people out in the field this summer to do checks of addresses and buildings to make sure they're still there or that they've gone up. So we've been pushing hiring of census workers because it helps us if they're from the local community. We've had billboards, we've put it on our website, we've done radio ads. We're pushing it at all our Detroit work efforts at our centers because it's an application that can be pretty daunting for someone, but we really are trying to encourage people to apply for those census jobs.
So there are three challenges here. One is the census is hoping that 55% of census return come through internet, online return. The problem is they never tested that capacity. So that's a problem. Second is the way behind on hiring census staff. And again, the shutdown had something to do with it, but more than that, I think the Census Bureau is not ready yet. So that's a second problem. What is it that we can do from our end to make sure that we start spreading the word that Census is hiring and support that process as much as we can. In addition, we need to mobilize community-based organizations to be a second line of support for the census. Lastly is that we so many aspects of the census operation, because of budget issues, were not tested. So we're not sure exactly how things will result. So.
Well, healthcare.gov worked really well, so I think this will.
Well,
So-
no, and the assistance centers, actually, if we can have the partnerships with all the nonprofits and the churches, they could actually, we've done it in the past, Access has, La Salle has, we actually provide a space privately so we can assist people to fill out the form. And the educational aspects, it's interesting, in 1980, we had a big fear also in 1980, and I remember we kept telling them to fill out the form because that was a recognized official form. And when Embassy came around, 1980, the census was one part of it that they used. And we kept talking about that because people didn't realize that, because you had to show proof that you paid taxes, and you had to show proof that you filled out some kind, and the census was, so we use that a lot to say, don't be afraid, and that's what the fear aspects of it, but without the assistance centers and the churches and that, and the corporation of the city, we can get it done.
There's one important, I think, note about this census. And one message that we're really going to be pushing is it's 10 questions, 10 minutes. So they've done away with the long form, which
Yeah.
I talked to someone yesterday who didn't fill out the census 10 years ago because it was too long. So I think that will help us do some, increase our response rates if we push that this is not going to take you an hour or 2
An hour or
hours,
two, yeah.
but that'll be short, 10 questions, 10 minutes.
10 questions, 10 minutes for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, very
So-
good.
and-
My
yeah.
Got it down
contribution,
pat,
my
right?
contribution to the cause.
And
Yeah, and
everyone
Go ahead.
we lose $1,800 per person per year
For 10 years.
for 10 years. So
Yeah.
that's a huge
That's
amount of
great
money.
math. That's
Yeah.
a really important figure. Yeah, no, and actually, a decade ago, not that it matters what happened 10 years ago, we thought about getting rid of the long form then because, they had just started the American Community Survey,
Right.
right, which is the kind of detailed, more frequent update. It was too radical of an idea then, but it's certainly an idea that's come now. We got 60 seconds left. Mr. Mayor, going to close this out. Why this is important. Your final message.
I mean, this is going to be it, and we're starting to talk in conversations like this, where we just need you to be talking to your friends, to your employees, your neighbors, about why it's important to fill it out, because people listen to people they trust more than they listen to government messages.
That's right.
So for everyone in the audience, this is something that you will hopefully be hearing a lot about over the next year. The business community, the nonprofit community, the community organizations, church groups. It's going to take all of us to get this right. Because if we don't get the census numbers right for the city, for the region, for the state, as the mayor said, we're going to be paying for it for the next decade. And there's just far too much money involved. There's political ramifications for this. I've been around the federal government long enough that the federal government has always been trying to find what's the best way to get the best census count possible. You deploying the best resources in the most efficient way. I don't quite get that feeling this time around. No. Obviously, I'm not part of it this time around, but the sense of making sure that we get the most accurate count doesn't seem to be the overriding ethos. Not that there hasn't been controversy in past censuses in terms of how dollars are spent, but the ethos has always been the same. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you for making this an issue. For the rest of our panel, thank you for all that you have done and will do for that. Certainly, we're going to be engaged with you on this, and hopefully, Victoria, you can count on us to, be the conduit to the business community, get the business community behind your efforts. So thank you all very much.
Thank you for bringing it up. It's
Thank you
important.
all.